For Addie Hartwell, at 19 years old, everything disappeared on a Tuesday when her mother's landlord changed the locks with their things still inside. Her sister Petra was 16. They had $43 and one garbage bag of clothes. 3 weeks later, a lawyer found them at a shelter to say their estranged grandfather had left them a dying dairy farm in rural Wisconsin. 6 years of unpaid debt, broken equipment, and animals no one had properly cared for in longer than anyone wanted to admit. Everyone who heard the story said those two girls were done. The milk room said otherwise. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Addie Hartwell had known since childhood that money was always the third person in the room. She could feel it without anyone saying so. The grocery total got checked twice at the register. The heat dropped at 9, even in January. Certain conversations stopped the moment she walked in. They lived in a 2-bedroom rental in Kenosha with just Addie, Petra, and their mother Wren. She worked as a medical billing coordinator at a clinic on the north side of town, reliable and careful with every dollar she brought home. The three of them weren't wealthy and weren't desperate. They were that particular kind of stable that requires constant attention to hold together. Addie had graduated from Kenosha Lincoln High School the previous June and was enrolled at Gateway Technical College for the fall semester, business administration. Nothing glamorous, but she had a plan. Petra was a sophomore, quiet and serious. The kind of student teachers described as self-directed because they didn't know what else to call a 16-year-old who read scientific journals for fun and argued with her biology textbook in the margins. Wren died on a Saturday morning in late August. A cardiac event, the paramedics said. She was 44 years old, had gone to bed Friday, feeling tired, and did not wake up. There was no manual for what followed. Addie handled the phone calls and paperwork because someone had to, and Petra was 16 and completely wrecked. They buried Wren 9 days later in a service with 11 people present. Wren's sister drove up from Illinois, stayed 2 nights, and left. Nobody else materialized with offers of help. What came instead was a knock from their landlord, Gerald Frisch, 12 days after the funeral. The lease was in Wren's name. Her income was gone. Without a co-signer, the girls had 30 days to vacate. Addie had already gone through her mother's accounts by then. Wren had kept a small savings buffer, around $4,000, but carried balances on 2 credit cards, and the funeral had run higher than Addie had expected. After settling what she could, $1,100 remained. Not enough for a deposit and first month anywhere in Kenosha, not for 2 people with no rental history and no adult willing to sign for them. She asked Wren's sister. The answer was no. Delivered with apologies, Addie stopped listening to halfway through. She asked 2 of her mother's close friends. Same answer, different words. They moved into a shelter on 15th Street on October 3rd. Addie deferred her enrollment at Gateway. Petra missed 3 weeks of school, then went back because sitting at the shelter all day was worse than not sitting there. Addie worked shifts at a convenience store 4 blocks away and spent her evenings going through options that never quite added up. That was their situation when the letter arrived. It came addressed to Addie Hartwell, routed at least once before reaching her at the shelter. The return address was a law office in Madison, Wisconsin. She almost threw it away without opening it, assuming some creditor had found her mother's name in a database somewhere. She read it on a Thursday evening, sitting on her cot while Petra slept. The letter was from an attorney named Douglas Farr, writing on behalf of the estate of Callan James Hartwell, deceased. Her grandfather, a man Addie had met exactly twice. Once at age 7, when Wren had driven them to Wisconsin without much explanation, and once at age 11, when he showed up at their apartment for 2 hours and then left. She remembered a tall man with a sunburned neck who had a habit of not finishing his sentences. Callan Hartwell had died 6 weeks earlier from complications following a stroke. He was 71. His only child, Wren, had predeceased him by less than 2 months. Under his will and Wisconsin inheritance law, his estate passed to his grandchildren. His estate was Stonebrick Dairy. The letter described it plainly: 590 acres in Dane County, roughly 40 miles southwest of Madison. A dairy operation, or what had been one. 63 Holstein cows. A farmhouse built in 1949. A milk processing room, 2 barns, and an equipment shed. The property carried $74,000 in outstanding debt against a county agricultural loan. The operation had not generated positive revenue in 6 years. The estate held no liquid assets to transfer. What it offered them, in plain terms, was land, debt, and sick animals. Addie read the letter 3 times. Then she woke Petra and handed it over. Petra read it slowly. Then she looked at her sister. "Is this real?" "Lawyer's number is on page 2, Addie said. "We can call in the morning." Petra looked at the letter again, then at the ceiling where a water stain had spread into a shape that might have been Wisconsin if you tilted your head, then back at Addie. "We don't know anything about cows." "No," Addie said. "We don't." Neither of them slept much that night. They called Douglas Farr's office the next morning from a pay phone outside the shelter, because Addie's cell had been shut off 2 weeks earlier. The attorney was matter-of-fact. Yes, the inheritance was real. Yes, both sisters were named. Yes, there were outstanding debts, and yes, the property had been sitting without proper management for the better part of a year while Addie Hartwell recovered from a stroke and then didn't. Farr told them he'd send the deed paperwork to whatever address they provided. Addie gave him the shelter's address and hung up. She had $1,100, a deferred college enrollment, a 16-year-old sister, and the deed to a failing dairy farm coming in the mail. She stood outside the pay phone for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then she walked back inside and told Petra to start packing. They took a Greyhound to Madison and rented the cheapest car Addie could find with her mother's old Visa, which still had $340 on it. The drive to Dane County took 40 minutes. Grover Falls wasn't a town so much as an arrangement of buildings, a gas station, a feed supply store, a diner called Patton's, and a post office that shared a wall with what appeared to be a bait shop. Nobody on the main street paid them much attention when they stopped to ask for directions to Stonebrook Road. The farm was 3 miles past the county line, down a gravel track that ran between 2 rows of old oak trees. Addie pulled the rental to a stop in front of the farmhouse and cut the engine. Neither of them said anything for a while. The house was standing, which felt like the most generous thing you could say about it. The white paint had gone gray and was peeling in long strips from the siding. 2 windows on the second floor were covered with plywood. The porch sagged visibly on its left side, and the front steps had separated from the main structure by a gap wide enough to catch a boot heel. A rusted wind vane on the roof had frozen mid-spin, pointing somewhere between north and nowhere. The smell hit them when they got out of the car. Not just manure, though there was plenty of that. Something underneath it, sour and close, the smell of animals that weren't being properly fed or cleaned. The barns were worse than the house. The main dairy barn's sliding door had come off one of its tracks and leaned inward at an angle, letting in weather. Inside, in the dim light coming through gaps in the roof, they found 31 cows. Not 63, as the letter had stated. 31. A hand-painted sign on the wall still read Stonebrook, EST 1961. Below it, someone had taped a notice from Dane County Agricultural Services dated 8 months earlier, citing the operation for inadequate animal welfare standards. Petra stood in the barn doorway for a long time, looking at the cows. Several were thin. One had a visible leg wound that hadn't been treated. Someone was supposed to be managing this place, Addie said. They weren't, Petra said. They found the milk processing room at the back of the second barn, padlocked, a handwritten note taped to the door that read Private C. Hartwell in her grandfather's handwriting. Addie tried 2 keys from the ring Douglas Farr had sent to the Grover Falls post office. Neither fit. She made a note and moved on. The farmhouse had running water and electricity, both of them barely functional. The kitchen ceiling carried water damage from a leak that had dried but never been repaired. The refrigerator was empty and smelled wrong. One upstairs bedroom had a collapsed section of ceiling plaster piled on the floor like a small snowdrift. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Petra sat down on the kitchen floor, which was the cleanest flat surface available, and said nothing for several minutes. "We could sell it," she said. We get maybe 30 cents on the dollar for land with this much debt attached to it, Addie said. That's still money. Not enough. Petra looked up at the water-stained ceiling. So what exactly is your plan, Addie? Addie didn't have a plan. She had $1,100, a stubbornness that had always served her better than it had any right to, and a feeling she couldn't yet name. Something between grief and determination, sitting in her chest like a stone she wasn't ready to put down. She told Petra she needed a few days to understand what they were actually dealing with before they made any decisions. The neighbor who arrived the next afternoon wasn't interested in waiting. He came in a clean pickup truck and introduced himself as Lyle Dunmore, a distant cousin on the Hartwell side, though he didn't specify how distant. He was 56, thick through the shoulders, with the easy confidence of someone who expected to get what he came for. He walked through the farmhouse kitchen without being invited to, glancing at the walls and sealing the way people do when they're mentally pricing things. You girls shouldn't have to deal with all this, he said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table as if he lived there. Callan's debt is real. The county notice is real. Without serious capital to turn this place around, you're just postponing the inevitable. He set a business card on the table. I've got a buyer lined up. Fair offer. You'd walk away clean. Addie picked up the card and looked at it. We haven't decided anything yet, she said. Lyle smiled in a way that didn't reach much past his mouth. Don't wait too long. He left his coffee cup on the table. He hadn't asked if he could have any. Lyle Dunmore came back twice more that first week. The first time, he brought a man he introduced as a property assessor, who walked the grounds with a clipboard and said very little. The second time, he came alone and raised his offer by $8,000, presenting this as generosity. Addie told him they still hadn't decided. He drove off slower than he'd arrived, which she took as a sign that patience wasn't something he carried in large supply. The sisters spent those first days doing two things at once: keeping the remaining cows alive and trying to understand the full scope of what they'd inherited. Both tasks were harder than they looked. Neither Addie nor Petra had grown up around animals of any kind. Their mother had rented apartments their whole lives. The closest either of them had come to a cow was a petting zoo at age 8. Now they were responsible for 31 Holstein dairy cows, several of them visibly unhealthy, all of them requiring feeding, watering, and basic care on a twice-daily schedule regardless of what else was happening. The first morning, Addie pulled up instructional videos on her phone while standing in the barn. She watched a man on YouTube demonstrate how to fill a water trough. She watched another explain feed ratios. She wrote notes in a spiral notebook she'd bought at the Grover Falls gas station. Petra, always the faster reader, went through a basic dairy husbandry manual she'd found on Callan's kitchen shelf, dog-eared and annotated in their grandfather's handwriting. They made mistakes. Addie overfilled a trough and spent an hour mopping up the overflow in boots 2 sizes too large she'd found in the equipment shed. Petra miscalculated a feed ratio and had to redo the entire evening round. Small humiliations that neither of them mentioned to the other. One cow, a large older animal they started quietly calling Agnes, had developed a habit of shoving Addie sideways whenever she entered the stall, testing her, apparently finding the results interesting. The injured cow with a leg wound needed a vet. Addie called the only large animal practice in the county, and a woman named Dr. Fin Osaka drove out the following morning. She treated the wound, vaccinated the herd for 2 conditions she said were long overdue, and left a typed care sheet. The bill was $340. Addie paid it and didn't mention the amount to Petra. By the end of the first week, they had a working daily routine. By the end of the second, they could get through morning and evening chores without checking the phone once. The cows were eating. The trough levels were stable. The injured leg was healing. Small things, but real ones. Petra still hadn't agreed to stay permanently. She'd said she wanted to give it a month before they made any decisions. Addie accepted that because it was better than the alternative, and because she'd seen her sister's face in the barn during those first days, watchful, absorbing everything, asking questions she tried to make sound casual. Petra was interested whether she admitted it or not. The morning Arlo Beckett arrived, Addie was replacing a broken hinge on the main barn door with hardware she'd bought at the feed store in town. She heard a truck pull up behind her and turned, already composing her response to Lyle Dunmore, and registered that she'd never seen this man before. He was in his mid-60s, lean and deliberate in the way he moved, wearing a canvas jacket with a Dane County Agricultural Extension patch, so faded she almost missed it. He introduced himself as Arlo Beckett, 31 years as a dairy extension agent, retired 3 years ago, lived about a mile and a half east. He'd known Addie Hartwell, not well, but enough to recognize Stonebrook when he passed it. He'd seen lights in the farmhouse windows and figured he'd stop. Addie had learned caution quickly. Lyle had already demonstrated that people who showed up uninvited usually wanted something. "What do you want?" she said. Arlo seemed to appreciate the directness. "Right now, to tell you that the cow in stall 4 is showing early signs of mastitis. You want to catch that before it moves through the herd." He was right. They went and looked together, and he was right. He didn't offer to fix it. He explained what to watch for, described the treatment protocol, and told her where to call for the medication. Then he leaned against the barn wall with his hands in his pockets and waited to see if she had questions. She had 20 minutes worth of questions. Arlo answered every one of them. He didn't talk down to her, didn't add qualifiers about her age or her lack of experience. When she got something wrong, he said so plainly and explained why. When she reasoned through something correctly on her own, he said that too. He treated her like someone capable of learning, which was the first time since arriving in Dane County that anyone had done that. Before he left, he looked out across the property with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Your grandfather had something real here once," he said. "Early 2000s, this was a solid small operation. The land's still good. Whatever fell apart, that part didn't." He paused. "It's a lot of work for 2 people." "We know," Addie said. "I'm retired," he said. "I've got time, if you want another set of eyes now and then." Petra appeared in the barn doorway. She'd been just inside, listening. "We like that," she said. Addie looked at her. Petra held the look without flinching. That settled it. Arlo came back the following morning. And the morning after that. The padlock on the milkroom door had defeated every key on Callan's ring and 2 of Arlo's picks. A locksmith in Madison quoted $180 for a service call, which Addie filed under problems she'd solve when she had to. For the first 3 weeks, the milkroom stayed locked, and they worked around it. It was Petra who found the key. She was cleaning out Callan's bedroom on a gray Thursday morning, the kind of task both of them had been avoiding because going through a dead man's belongings felt intrusive even when the dead man was family. Most of it was straightforward: clothes, a few books, a dresser with the ordinary contents of an old man's dresser. In a nightstand drawer, she found a small tin that had once held cough drops. Inside the tin was a folded index card. On the index card, in Addie Hartwell's compressed handwriting, were 3 lines. Key behind the street Bridget figure. Second shelf, west wall of equipment shed. Keep cold above all things. There was a small ceramic figurine on the equipment shed's second shelf, a woman in a blue robe, paint worn smooth from years of handling. Behind it, taped to the wall with electrical tape that had gone brittle, was a key on a wire loop. Petra brought it back to the milkroom. Addie watched her fit it into the padlock. It opened on the first turn. The room was roughly 12 feet square, built into the back corner of the second barn with its own insulated walls. An old chest freezer ran along the left side, humming steadily, connected to a dedicated electrical line that bypassed the barn's main circuit. 3 wooden shelves ran floor to ceiling on the far wall, packed with equipment. Glass jars of varying sizes sealed with wax. Stainless steel containers with hand-labeled lids. Coiled rubber tubing. A temperature gauge. 2 large ceramic crocks covered with cloth and weighted stones. A folding table in the center held a wooden box the size of a suitcase, latched closed. The smell was unusual. Sharp and clean with something alive underneath it. Vaguely tangy, like good cheese in a cool cellar. Petra stood very still in the doorway. Then she walked to the shelves and picked up one of the sealed jars, holding it to the light from the single bare bulb overhead. Inside, something moved, a slow, translucent cloud shifting in liquid. "It's a culture," she said. "A what?" Addie said. "A fermentation culture. Living bacteria." Petra set the jar down carefully and picked up another, then a third, examining labels in Callan's cramped hand. Each one had a date, a temperature notation, and a short code she didn't recognize. The oldest dated label she found was from 11 years back. These have been in here for years. The freezer's been keeping them viable. She paused. He was maintaining these. The wooden box on the table contained notebooks. 8 of them, the same green cover composition books you'd find in any school supply aisle. Petra opened the top one and read in silence for long enough that Addie stopped watching and started examining the ceramic crocks instead. Addie, Petra's voice had changed register. She handed the notebook over. The first page was dated 16 years earlier. What followed was meticulous. Page after page of breeding records, milk composition tests, protein analyses, fat content measurements. Callan had been tracking his herd with the precision of a researcher, not a farmer. He'd been selecting for a specific trait in his cattle for over a decade, cross-referencing bloodlines, documenting outcomes. The notation appeared on almost every page, A2/A2. Addie was not a scientist, but she'd spent 3 weeks in the Grover Falls Public Library whenever Arlo watched the cows, reading everything she could find about dairy operations, and she recognized the term. A2 milk came from cows carrying a specific variant of the beta-casein protein gene. Most commercial dairy herds were mixed A1/A2 or predominantly A1. Purebred A2/A2 herds were rare and required years of deliberate selective breeding. The milk they produced was easier to digest and commanded prices 3 to 4 times above standard market rates. How many of our cows are A2/A2? Petra said. I don't know. Addie said. He'd know. Petra took the notebook back and turned toward the end. The most recent entries were from roughly 14 months ago, around the time of Callan's stroke. The handwriting in those last pages was looser, the entries shorter, a man clearly struggling. But he'd kept writing. The second-to-last entry read, full conversion close. 3 cows remaining to test. Cultures holding well. Do not let this go cold. The final entry was a single line. Tell no one until it's certain. Petra read it twice. Then she sat down on the floor of the milk room with the notebook in her lap, and Addie sat beside her, and they stayed like that for a while in the cold, humming quiet. Addie Hartwell had spent 16 years quietly building something. He'd done it without telling anyone, without fanfare, without outside help. He'd been dismissed as a struggling small farmer with a failing operation and mounting debt, and underneath that story he'd been doing methodical, patient work that most commercial dairy operations would have needed significant investment to attempt. He left it all here. The cultures, the records, the herd, the locked room, the note in the tin. He'd left it specifically to the 2 girls who hadn't known him, with no explanation and no instruction beyond 3 lines on an index card. He knew what this was worth, Petra said. Yes, Addie said. He left it to us. He left it to us. Petra looked at the shelves, at the jars with their careful labels and their slow living contents. Her voice was quiet and completely level. We're not selling this farm. The first thing they needed was confirmation. Callan's notebooks were meticulous, but they were one man's records, kept alone, verified by no one. Before Addie would let herself believe what those pages described, she needed someone else to look at the herd. Arlo knew a veterinary geneticist at the University of Wisconsin Extension Service, a woman named Carol Stein, who ran genetic testing for small dairy operations at rates that were, as Arlo put it, reasonable for someone who knew how to ask. Addie called her on a Monday morning, explained what they'd found without explaining too much, and asked if she could come test the herd. Carol arrived 9 days later with a portable testing kit and a graduate student who carried most of the equipment. She took blood samples from all 31 cows, tagged each one, and said results would take 3 weeks. Those 3 weeks were not idle. The milk room had unlocked something in Petra that Addie hadn't seen since before their mother died. She read everything she could find about A2 beta-casein protein, about fermentation cultures, about artisan dairy production. She taught herself the basics of cheese making from a library book and a YouTube channel run by a woman in Vermont, and spent 2 evenings a week in the milk room, working with the cultures Callan had maintained, following his notes, keeping the temperatures precise. She had a scientist's instinct for process. She could hold 3 variables in her head at once and notice when one drifted. Addie focused on the business side. She tracked current A2 milk prices and researched what artisan dairy operations in the Midwest were charging for cultured products. She mapped out what it would cost to bring the processing room up to state licensing standards and found, to her surprise, that it wasn't as far from compliant as she'd feared. Callan had built it carefully. It had fallen behind on a few regulatory requirements, but the structure was solid. Arlo watched all of this without saying much. He showed up every morning, helped with the herd, and otherwise stayed out of the way. One Thursday evening, sitting at the kitchen table going through Callan's oldest notebooks, he looked up and said, "Your grandfather was a very stubborn man." Was that a compliment? Petra said. In farming, Arlo said yes. Always yes. Carol Stein called on a Wednesday morning. 24 of the 31 cows were confirmed A2/A2. The remaining 7 were mixed, which meant the herd could be refined further over time. But the core of what Callan had built was real and documentable. Addie sat with that number for a long moment after hanging up. 24 A2/A2 animals, a set of live cultures maintained for over a decade, breeding records going back 16 years. It wasn't a failing dairy farm. It was a research project that had been dressed up to look like one. It was Arlo who suggested Dr. Priya Nair. He'd crossed paths with her at an agricultural conference 2 years before his retirement. She was a food scientist at UW-Madison, specializing in dairy fermentation and probiotic culture development, with a particular interest in heritage and small-scale operations. Arlo described her as someone who got bored easily by ordinary work. He sent her a 2-sentence email and a photo Petra had taken of the milkroom shelves. She replied within 4 hours, asking when she could visit. Dr. Nair arrived on a Friday morning in early December, driving a university-plated car and carrying a cooler for sample transport. She was 43, compact and direct, with the habit of examining things thoroughly before commenting on them. She spent 2 full hours in the milkroom before she said anything substantive. She examined the cultures with a hand lens, reviewed 3 notebooks in full, checked the freezer logs, and moved through a series of technical questions for Petra that started simple and got progressively more specific. Petra answered every one of them. At the end of the 2 hours, Dr. Nair sat down at the folding table and looked at both sisters. "These cultures are unusual," she said. "Without full lab analysis, I can't say definitively, but the visual profile and the maintenance records suggest your grandfather developed something specific here. The bacterial strains he was working with don't match any commercial starter culture I recognize." She tapped the notebook in front of her. He was isolating and selecting. "This is strain development work. Years of it. What does that mean for us?" Addie said, "It means what you have in this room may be proprietary. A documented heritage culture with this kind of lineage, paired with a verified A2/A2 herd, is the kind of thing artisan dairy producers spend years trying to build and usually can't." She looked at the shelves. "Can I take samples back to the lab?" They gave her permission that afternoon. Her results came back 3 weeks later. The cultures contained 2 bacterial strains she couldn't identify in any existing database, both producing flavor compounds associated with high-end European-style fermented dairy. The report used the phrase "potentially novel" twice and recommended further study. The week after receiving that report, Addie called the Grover Falls feed store to order supplies. The man behind the counter asked how things were going up at Stonebrick. She told him fine. He mentioned that the Dunmore fellow had been asking around town about the property again. She said she was aware, thanked him, and hung up. She looked out the kitchen window at the barn, where Petra and Arlo were moving through the afternoon, feeding in the easy rhythm they'd built over 2 months of daily work together. The herd was healthier. The milk room was operational. The processing room licensing application was 2 weeks from submission. The farm wasn't fixed. Debt remained. Structural repairs waited. The path forward was long and specific and required things they didn't yet have. But something had shifted in the texture of the days. The work had stopped feeling like survival and started feeling like building. That distinction mattered more than Addie could easily explain. It carried them through the cold months. It also made what happened next hit harder. The certified letter arrived on a Thursday in late January, forwarded from Douglas Farr's office with a handwritten note that said simply, "You'll want to call me." Addie read it standing at the kitchen counter, still in her barn coat from morning chores. The letter was from an attorney in Madison representing Lyle Dunmore. It asserted that Lyle had entered a verbal purchase agreement with Addie Hartwell in the spring of 2 years prior, covering the full 590 acres of Stonebrick Dairy for an agreed price of $210,000. The letter claimed this agreement had been interrupted by Callan's stroke and subsequent death before formal documentation could be completed. It further claimed that Lyle, as the intended buyer of record, held a legitimate interest in the property that superseded the inheritance claim of 2 minors with no established connection to the agricultural operation. There was a second page. It listed the $74,000 agricultural loan currently held against the property and noted that Lyle Dunmore was a board member of the county lending cooperative that held the note. The letter did not say explicitly that the loan would be called early. It didn't need to. Addie called Farr. He told her what she'd already worked out for herself. The verbal agreement claim was almost certainly unenforceable without documentation, but contesting it would require an attorney, time, and money she didn't have in surplus. The loan situation was more complicated. A cooperative board had some discretion in how it managed distressed agricultural accounts. If Lyle had enough influence there, he could create serious pressure without technically doing anything illegal. "He's squeezing from 2 sides," Farr said. "I know," Addie said. "What does fighting this actually cost?" Farr gave her a range. It was a wide range, and the bottom of it was still more than she had in the farm's operating account. She didn't tell Petra that day. She told herself she needed to think first, which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she didn't know how to say it. Petra had been the one who'd said they weren't selling. Petra had been the one in the milk room every other evening, coaxing Callan's cultures through temperature fluctuations, treating the whole project with the same focused care she gave everything she decided mattered. Addie had brought them to this farm. She had pushed them both past the point of easy retreat. And now a man with a board seat and a lawyer was making the walls close in. She told Petra on Saturday morning, after the herd was fed and before Arlo arrived. Petra read the letter twice. Her face went through several things in quick succession, none of them easy to watch. "So what do we do?" she said. "I'm still working that out," Addie said. Petra set the letter on the table. "We fight it. That costs money we don't have right now. Then we find the money. Petra, we're not settling." Her voice came out harder than she likely intended. "We're not giving him anything. I didn't say we should. You're thinking it. I can tell when you're thinking something you don't want to say." The argument that followed was the worst they'd had since arriving at Stonebrick. Not loud, which made it worse somehow. Petra said Addie always looked for the exit when things got difficult. Addie said Petra was 17 and didn't understand what it meant to be legally responsible for a $74,000 debt with no credit history and no backup. Petra said she understood exactly what it meant and had understood it longer than Addie wanted to admit. Addie said things she shouldn't have about their mother, about the shelter, about what it had felt like to be 19 with $43 in a garbage bag. Petra went upstairs and didn't come back down until evening. Arlo arrived in the middle of it and let himself into the barn without knocking on the house door. When Addie came out an hour later, he was treating one of the younger cows for a minor hoof issue and didn't look up. "Bad morning," he said. "Legal trouble," Addie said. He listened while she explained. He asked 2 questions and didn't offer opinions she hadn't asked for. When she finished, he was quiet for a while, working. Then he said, "Have you talked to Priya?" Addie hadn't thought of that. Dr. Nair, when Addie called that evening, listened without interrupting. Then she said she wanted to think overnight before responding. She called back the following morning. The university had a small business development program for agricultural operations with documented research value. She explained. She had already mentioned Stonebrick informally to a colleague there. The culture documentation and genetic records were exactly the kind of thing the program was designed to support. It wouldn't cover legal fees directly, but program affiliation came with resources, including access to a legal clinic that worked with small agricultural operations at reduced cost. It was the first solid piece of ground in 5 days. But the loan pressure didn't wait. 10 days after the first letter, a second arrived from the lending cooperative. Formal notice that Stonebrick Dairy's agricultural account had been flagged for review due to insufficient revenue activity. A meeting was scheduled. Addie was required to appear and demonstrate the operation's viability or discuss restructuring terms. She was 19 years old, and she had to walk into a bank meeting and convince a board that included the man trying to take her farm that she deserved to keep it. She sat with that for a full evening, going through Callan's notebooks, Priya's lab report, Carol Stein's genetic results. She organized everything into a folder. Then she made a list of numbers: milk prices, projected output, processing licensing timelines, comparable artisan dairy revenues from operations Arlo had pointed her toward. At some point after midnight, Petra came downstairs and sat across from her without saying anything. She looked at the folder, at the numbers on the legal pad, at her sister's face. She picked up a pen and started checking Addie's math. They didn't discuss the argument. They worked until 2 in the morning, and when they finally went to bed, the folder was thorough and the numbers were right, and something between them had been repaired, not completely, but enough. The cooperative board meeting was held on a Tuesday morning in a conference room above the Grover Falls post office, which shared a wall with the bait shop. 6 board members sat on one side of the table. Addie and Petra sat on the other, while Dunn Moore was in the third chair from the left, and he looked at them with the composed expression of a man who had already decided how this would end. Addie had dressed carefully. She was 19 and looked it and couldn't do anything about either fact, so she decided not to try. She set the folder on the table and opened it. She spoke for 22 minutes without notes. She presented Carol Stein's genetic testing results, the full count of confirmed A2/A2 animals, and the market rate differential for verified A2 milk versus standard commodity pricing. Then came Dr. Nair's laboratory report on the cultures, including the phrase potentially novel bacterial strains, and the University Business Development Program's formal letter of affiliation, signed by the program director. She walked through a 3-year revenue projection built on comparable artisan dairy operations Arlo had identified, conservative and moderate scenarios side by side. Petra had prepared a 1-page summary of the processing room licensing timeline with the submission receipt attached. Nobody said anything for a moment after Addie finished. The board treasurer, a woman at the far end of the table, asked 2 specific questions about the revenue projections. Addie answered both. The treasurer made a note. Lyle said the projections were speculative. Addie agreed that all projections were speculative by definition and noted that the genetic documentation and the university affiliation were not. Lyle said the operation still carried significant debt. Addie said yes, which was why they were requesting a restructured payment schedule rather than relief, and slid a 1-page restructuring proposal across the table. The board voted 4-2 to approve a 90-day review period with suspended loan payments. Lyle voted no. The treasurer voted yes. Addie and Petra drove back to the farm in silence. When they got out of the car, Petra stood in the cold for a moment looking at the barn. 90 days, she said. 90 days, Addie confirmed. Then we'd better get moving. Dr. Nair presented findings from her Stonebrick research at a UW Food Science Symposium in March. She described the culture strains, the breeding documentation, and the farm's combination of verified genetics and heritage fermentation as an example of what long-term small-scale agricultural research could produce. She didn't use Stonebrick's name in the formal presentation, but she mentioned it in conversation afterward to several colleagues. One of those colleagues knew Wendell Knox. Knox ran Birchwood Creamery out of a converted warehouse in Milwaukee. He'd spent 11 years building one of the Midwest's better-regarded artisan dairy brands, specializing in small-batch cultured products. Aged cheeses, kefir, cultured butter, sold through specialty grocers and restaurant accounts across 4 states. He'd been trying to source verified A2/A2 milk for 2 years and kept running into the same problem. There wasn't enough of it, and most producers who claimed it couldn't document it properly. He called Addie on a Wednesday morning in April. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. He asked specific questions and wrote down the answers. At the end of it, he asked if he could come see the operation. He arrived the following week with his head of sourcing. They spent a full day at Stonebrook, the barn, the milk room, the processing facility, Callan's notebooks, his lab report. Knox handled the culture jars with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what he was holding. He asked Petra to walk him through the fermentation maintenance process, which she did in precise detail, and he listened without interrupting. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table across from both sisters and made an offer. A 3-year supply agreement for A2/A2 milk at a per hundredweight rate that was 3.5 times standard commodity pricing, with annual volume increases tied to her expansion. Birchwood would also license the use of Callan's culture strains for their specialty line, with a royalty structure that would provide supplemental income as the product went to market. In exchange, Knox wanted full documentation rights and first right of refusal on expanded supply. Addie read the term sheet twice. Petra read it once and looked at Arlo, who had come over that evening without being specifically asked. He read it, said it was a fair deal, and set it back down. From Arlo, that meant it was a good one. They signed 2 weeks later, after Addie's attorney, sourced through the UW Legal Clinic, reviewed the language, and negotiated 3 minor amendments that Knox accepted without argument. The agreement was announced in a Wisconsin agricultural trade publication the following month. The piece described Birchwood Creamery's new sourcing partnership and mentioned Stonebrook Dairy's A2/A2 herd and heritage culture library. Short, technical, aimed at an industry readership. Most people would never see it. Lyle Dunmore's attorney filed a motion to dismiss the verbal agreement lawsuit 11 days after it ran. Addie heard from Douglas Farr by phone that afternoon. The claim had been withdrawn without prejudice, which was legal language for dropped without admission of wrongdoing. Farr called it what it was. The farm now had a documented 3-year revenue agreement with an established regional company. Taking the case to trial would cost Lyle money and produce a public record that made him look predatory against 2 teenagers who'd rebuilt a failing operation from nothing. He'd done the math and didn't like the answer. Addie thanked Farr and hung up. She walked out to the barn, where Petra was finishing the afternoon feeding. Agnes, the large Holstein who had spent their first weeks testing Addie with well-timed shoulder checks, turned from her hay and regarded both of them with the complete indifference that cows manage better than most creatures. "It's over," Addie said. Petra straightened up. "The lawsuit, filed to dismiss this morning." Petra was quiet for a moment. She nodded once, slowly, the way she did when she was processing something she'd half expected but still needed a breath to absorb. She went back to the feeding. Addie leaned against the stall and watched her. The barn was warm and close, smelling of hay and animals and the particular cold that clings to a Wisconsin April, even indoors. The herd moved around them in their unhurried way. 24 confirmed A2/A2 animals that an old man had spent 16 years building toward, in a place that had looked like nothing from the road. The ground was holding. After everything, it was finally holding. 3 years after Addie Hartwell stood in a shelter reading a letter she'd almost thrown away, Stonebrook Dairy had 39 confirmed A2/A2 cows, a state-licensed processing facility, a supply agreement renewed, once already and currently being renegotiated upward, and a small sign at the end of the gravel track that read Stonebrook Dairy, EST 1961, repainted by Petra on a slow Sunday in October. Addie was 22. Petra had turned 19 in March. The open day in early June was Arlo's idea. He called it modest. What arrived was closer to 70 people. Neighboring farmers, Birchwood Creamery staff, Dr. Nair with 2 graduate students, the lending cooperative's board treasurer who had voted yes on the restructuring and had since become an occasional presence at the farm, and Bed Osmond from the property half a mile down the road, who had been quietly leaving casseroles on their porch since November of year 1 without ever asking for anything in return. Wendell Knox came with his sourcing director and 2 production staff. The Birchwood relationship had expanded in year 2. The cultured specialty line, using Callan strains, had launched in 8 stores and was being picked up by 3 more. Knox had described it in trade press as a flagship product. Petra read the description twice and said nothing, which was how Addie knew she was pleased. Dr. Nair had published her research on the culture strains the previous winter. The paper named Stonebrook specifically and described Callan's work as informal research, producing outcomes comparable to formal laboratory development. A professor at Cornell had emailed requesting a visit. Petra had written back and scheduled it for September. Petra was enrolled part-time at UW-Madison in food science. She drove down twice a week and did the rest remotely, fitting coursework around the farm schedule with the same methodical approach she brought to everything. Her advisor had said her practical knowledge of fermentation culture was ahead of most second-year graduate students. Petra mentioned this to Addie the same day she heard it, which was the tell. Addie ran the operation. Accounts, supplier relationships, herd planning, licensing compliance. She had not re-enrolled at Gateway. She decided she was already doing the education and the credential could wait, though she allowed she might feel differently in 10 years. Arlo moved through the open day crowd with the ease of someone at home in what he was doing. He'd stopped describing his work at Stonebrook as consulting sometime in the second year. Nobody had changed any formal arrangement. It had simply shifted. Bet Osmond stood near the barn with food she'd brought herself, watching the afternoon with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd seen the whole arc from nearby and wanted no credit for it. Addie found her there around 4 and stood beside her without talking. "Your grandfather would have hated this many people on his property," Bet said. "You knew him well. Well enough. He was private and stubborn and didn't explain himself much." She looked at the barn. "He spent years on something he never got to finish. That's hard." Addie thought about the last entry in Callan's final notebook. "Do not let this go cold." "He left good notes," she said. Bet smiled. The milk room had been expanded in year 2, a modest addition that gave Priya's graduate student space without crowding the production area. Callan's original shelves still held cultures maintained in an unbroken line since before either sister was born. The chest freezer still ran on its dedicated circuit. The green composition notebooks sat in the wooden box on the top shelf, where Petra had put them the day they found them and where they'd stayed. The ceramic Street Bridget figurine stood beside the box. Petra had moved it from the equipment shed when they expanded the room. She hadn't explained why. While Dunmore had sold his county property the previous fall and relocated somewhere outside Milwaukee. The cooperative had a new board member in his seat, a woman who ran a sheep dairy operation 6 miles east and had stopped by once to look at the processing setup. She was direct and practical, and nothing she'd said had required Addie to choose her words carefully. That counted for more than it might sound. As the last cars moved up the gravel track toward the road, Addie stood in the milkroom doorway. Petra came and stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. What their grandfather had built here was not a dramatic thing. It was years of ordinary days, small choices compounding slowly, a man alone in a cold room watching for something he believed was there. He had kept temperatures and written dates and stayed with it long enough for it to matter. He'd done it without an audience and without certainty, and he'd locked the door when he was done for the day and come back the next morning. He'd left the key behind a saint on a shelf. Addie thought about a Tuesday in October with $43 in a garbage bag, a shelter cot and a pay phone and a bus ticket to a place she'd never been, a sagging porch and a barn that smelled wrong and a man who sat down in their kitchen without an invitation and left his cup on the table. None of it had looked like the start of anything. It had been. Petra reached up and straightened one of Callan's culture jars, a small adjustment, something slightly off-center made right. "Same time tomorrow," she said. "Same time tomorrow," Addie said. They turned off the light and walked back into the June evening. The herd moved toward the barn in the unhurried way of animals that know what comes next. The oaks along the gravel track stood full and green. Stonebrook Dairy settled into the last of the afternoon light, looking exactly like what it was. Something built from almost nothing. Something worth keeping. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.